Boruto Chapter 16 was an insane chapter for just about every type of Boruto fan. From even more scaling for Jura's true power, an insight into Boruto's training with Kashin Koji, and boy oh boy, if you're a shipper, you are eating good with this chapter, let me tell you that much. Anyways, this chapter consisted of a lot of talking, so don't expect much action, but the revelations that did occur are huge for the future of Boruto's story. So without further ado, let's get into this chapter review. So the chapter begins in a flashback where we can see Kashin Koji is training Boruto about the flying thunder god jutsu. Kashin Koji begins by explaining that space-time ninjutsu is the ability that can teleport a target to any location, whether it is the target itself or someone else. And according to Kashin Koji, this ability is innate to Otsutsuki's and also allows them the ability to fly. He then explains that Boruto has manifested this ability before on several different occasions. However, he describes these as outbursts that Boruto cannot purposefully reproduce. However, future Boruto came up with a system to combat this, where he managed to successfully control the power of space-time ninjutsu, where he marked a piece of metal with his chakra, and then he sensed the metal and was able to mark the location, allowing him to teleport. Kashin Koji explains that this jutsu Boruto created was as a result of him trying to master the Otsutsuki's space-time ninjutsu, but he inadvertently created an inferior jutsu to the flying Raijin Minato was proficient in. Now this is interesting because to my knowledge, Boruto is currently able to fly. However, he cannot use space-time ninjutsu like the Otsutsuki can. And the same goes for Eida, who can also fly but is not able to use space-time ninjutsu to teleport to certain locations. Whereas Kawaki has the ability to both use space-time ninjutsu and also fly. So perhaps flying isn't necessarily a byproduct of space-time ninjutsu like Kashin Koji stated, and is instead the first step in the process to gaining that ability. Otherwise, it wouldn't make much sense as to how Boruto and Eida would be able to fly without having the abilities of the space-time ninjutsu. Getting back to the chapter, Kashin Koji explains that metal acts as the best medium for Boruto to use this jutsu, and having a direct line of sight with the object makes Boruto's teleportation much more precise. Boruto then deduces that if an object is too far away, it would become difficult for him to be able to teleport accurately to that object, since he does not have direct line of sight. And Kashin Koji agrees and says that Boruto would essentially be gambling on which metal object he would arrive at due to him not being able to distinguish the two different locations. However, he then explains that future Boruto came up with a solution for this problem. He says that Boruto used different symbols with different shapes to be able to distinguish or accurately teleport to different locations, as he can sense the shapes rather than just a metal object. Kashin Koji then explains that Boruto now has the basic understanding of what future Boruto took 6 years to master. However, Boruto now needs to focus on actually training this skill, as it requires a large amount of focus. And Boruto agrees and says that he's willing to go one step at a time in order to master this technique. Now this is a huge step in the right direction for Boruto's character, as Boruto in part 1 would often take shortcuts when it comes to learning things in order to reach the end solution quicker and easier. However, this method of rushing things in the learning process came back to bite him, and Boruto realized that since he took so many shortcuts in his training, his knowledge and understanding of certain jutsu and concepts were much lower than those who took longer but completed the same process. This meant that in the short term, Boruto gained more power and was stronger, but quickly as time went on, people began to surpass him due to their better understanding and knowledge that comes from completing the full training. This concept was shown even further during the Chunin exams, where Boruto accepted the offer of using ninja tech in the competitions in order to see immediate results. Now this idea is extremely interesting and fitting for Boruto's character, and I can empathize with this concept, where in real life I often found myself, especially during school, taking shortcuts to reach the final destination, simply because I could solve the problem without having to show my workings, for example. And it's because Boruto is a prodigy that it means he can see how to reach the end solution without showing his workings, if I was to link that to a real world analogy. But now Boruto has seen the error in that methodology and is now willing to take the necessary steps to reach that end result, and that is what helped Boruto become so insanely strong after the time skip, because he took the time to master techniques rather than just learn them. Also, something interesting to know about this is the fact that these symbols, or medals as Boruto calls them, were seemingly just a part of Boruto's new fashion design. But that was not actually the case, and it turns out that these weren't for Boruto's new clothing design, but instead to help Boruto to be able to mark different areas and teleport to them. However, I must say that the fact that these are physical objects does limit the potential of this technique, as it means that people would be able to get a hold of these objects, or even shrink them in Kawaki's case, which is the same problem that Code had with his claw marks. However, if Boruto could use sealing marks like Minato did, he wouldn't have that problem, so you can definitely see the drawback of this jutsu that Boruto created, and why Kashin Koji called it an inferior version to what Minato had. Anyways, we then move on to another conversation between these two, where Boruto is asking about if Kashin Koji were to see a positive future, then why not tell everyone about it and try and tell people how to act in order to reach that future. But Kashin Koji states that the more people know about the future, the more drastically it will change. And with the numerous more possible futures, it would make 10 directions almost meaningless. Since if Kashin Koji were to use the ability, then he would see so many futures and they would all be so vastly different that it would be impossible to distinguish which one was actually going to occur. Since currently Kashin Koji can see that most futures kind of have the same path, but if he was to tell everyone about the future, then there would be so many different possibilities, if that makes sense. He then goes on to explain that those who know of the future, so him and Boruto for the time being, are called points of singularity. Kashin Koji states that the more people know about the future, the more it destabilizes the rail of fate, so he calls it. Or in other words, the future of their world. And points of singularity are people who must work in the shadows to guide those unaware of the future down a path that leads to the good future Kashin Koji can foresee. He then says that Eida will also become a point of singularity, since she will end up viewing the conversation between Boruto and Kashin Koji and become aware of what's to come in the future. We then realize that this entire flashback was in fact Eida who was viewing this conversation of the past in the present, and she is actually sat with Sarada and Sumire in her living room. It seems as though her reasoning for viewing this conversation is as a result of Sarada asking her to look into what transpired during the 3 years that has caused Boruto to become so distant from them, and why he now refuses to talk to them or be close with them. Eida then says to Sarada that as far as she could see, Boruto just doesn't want to tell them anything since it would put them in unnecessary danger. Regardless of what Eida just said, Sarada says that Boruto may not want to endanger them, but he shouldn't always try to bear everything on his own. She continues by saying that despite Konoha and Boruto both having a common enemy, Konoha still views Boruto as a traitor, and Sarada wants to help him against the hatred he receives from Konoha. She then very authoritatively asks Eida where Boruto is currently, but Sumire interjects here and says that maybe Boruto just doesn't want them to know where he is. Sarada seems very confused by this, as previously, Sumire would just sit there quietly amongst these kind of conversations. However, Sumire is clearly taking a moment to step up and speak her mind, which is a rare moment for her character. So it's clear something is definitely triggering a large emotional reaction from what Sarada said, and Sarada's reaction shows that this kind of attitude or moment from Sumire is very out of the ordinary for her personality. Sumire tells Sarada that it's because they don't know the vital information about Boruto that the village can remain peaceful and continue to function, and their best option for what they can do right now is to leave Boruto alone. Sarada then says that Boruto is just being too reckless, and if they hadn't have helped him, then he could have died in that situation. Sumire claps back and says that it was their fault that he even got in this situation in the first place. This moment is clearly showing the different ways that these two can love Boruto. So in Sarada's situation, it's clear that she is concerned for Boruto, but at the same time she isn't going to allow Boruto to do what he wants, as it means that he could end up endangering himself. Showing slightly more tough love, as she believes by not letting Boruto do as he pleases, it will be safer and better for Boruto mentally. Whereas Sumire, very similar to Hinata was with Naruto, has a massive trust in Boruto, where she believes that if Boruto has made a decision, that she should respect this and trust that he is making the correct judgment. Sumire is showing insane levels of trust here, and she believes that Boruto is making the right decision to protect both himself and the people around him. So it's clear both these characters love Boruto, but they both do it in very different ways, and the clash in ideals is what is causing them to almost fall apart. But getting back to the chapter, we can see Sumire is clearly upset with how Sarada is treating the situation, and how Sarada is acting like she knows what's best for Boruto. So she asks Sarada, has she even considered how Boruto feels in this moment? Sarada once again reacts in the same way she did when Sumire first piped up, completely confused by this sudden outburst. Sumire continues and says that she isn't doing this by choice, implying that she does want to alleviate the pain that Boruto has to endure, but the fact that he can't say things he wants to must take a huge toll on him mentally. However, Sarada is disregarding the mental sacrifices Boruto is taking to protect them and trying to do things her way, which is obviously not what Boruto wants. Sarada is taken aback by this and calls Sumire class rep again, which is a theme which is played on later, but it just shows you how Sarada is completely engulfed by her feelings towards Boruto, that she's forgetting to maintain her own relationships with her friends. And her calling Sumire class rep shows that Sarada doesn't view Sumire as a friend, but rather a colleague. Anyway, Sumire continues and says that Sarada doesn't just disregard Boruto's feelings, but also Sumire's. She says that Sarada is aware that Sumire likes Boruto. However, despite that, Sarada flew straight past Sumire and into Boruto's arms, while Sumire just had to stand next to it and watch on. Sumire says that she understands Sarada's feelings and why she would want to hug Boruto in that moment, but she says that where she is willing to understand and embrace Sarada's feelings in that moment, Sarada on the other hand doesn't consider Sumire's. Sumire then says that she shouldn't be talking about this right now, and it isn't time to be having a conversation like this, and just runs off. As she runs off, Sarada tries to call back to her by shouting class rep, but this served as a nail in the coffin between their relationship, as Sumire shows that she clearly is upset by the fact Sarada still refers to her as class rep, rather than her actual name, showing even further that Sarada doesn't consider how her actions and words will affect other people. While all of this is happening, we see Eida almost excited by this drama, despite the awkwardness of the situation, which when you think about it actually makes a lot of sense. Eida was a cyborg that belonged to Kara, meaning that she was completely cut off from the real world. However, she had experienced the real world prior to that. But that sense of humanity was stripped from her after joining Kara, so she was not able to experience the things a girl her age would have been able to experience. And that's why we see Eida now inside the village. She likes to do things like shopping and having girl gossip, because these were all things she was deprived of whilst in Kara. So it's very interesting to see that stance from Eida, and I do wonder as to whether Eida will serve as a medium between this drama and inevitably either draw out the truth from Sarada about her feelings towards Boruto, or bring these two back together to become friends once again. Anyways, we then cut to Shikamaru, who asks Eida via the mind transmission that he needs to have a conversation with her face to face. He explains that he doesn't think that it's appropriate that what they are about to discuss becomes disclosed to the Sensory team, and hence why they couldn't have the conversation telepathically. However, by doing this, it does mean that Shikamaru would be under the effects of Eida's charm, which he describes as causing his mind to become rusty, as he is unable to think straight when he's around her, which is displayed as the entire time he's around Eida, he constantly has sweat dripping off his face, almost to display he is nervous, as you would be if you were having a conversation with someone that you are forced to be in love with. Regardless, Shikamaru asks Eida about what actually happened in the Sand Village, and Eida tells Shikamaru that what he predicted was correct. A new Shinju has appeared called Ryu, and his subject or base is Shinki, and Eida also lets Shikamaru know that Ryu's target is Gaara. However, right now Gaara is sealed away, but since Ryu originates from Shinki and shares the same chakra characteristics, it seems as though Ryu is able to undo the original seal. So essentially, it's a race to see out of the shinobi going on the mission to the Land of Wind, as well as the Shinju who can reach Gaara first. Eida then explains that this information is based on footage she saw a few hours ago, since if she were to view the Shinju in real time, then she ends up seeing Mamushi instead. The first time she tried this, apparently it made her go pale, and she wonders what would occur if she were to continue to use her Senrigan to look at the Shinju when she sees Mamushi. Now, I don't think this revelation goes any further than what we see here, as this is clearly just Kishimoto's way of making it so the Shinju can still create plans without Eida finding out. It just creates a little sense of anticipation for the future, and also means that they can't just constantly counter the Shinju's moves. Because if they weren't able to do this, then it does seem a little too overpowered and it could ruin further revelations. However, with that said, I must say that this does tie into the future fight between Eida and Mamushi, where Eida is currently losing the mental warfare to Mamushi, so her battle will likely consist of her almost having to overcome this limitation of her Senrigan to defeat Mamushi. Because as of right now, he seems to be the perfect counter to her, which makes sense since Eida is his target. Anyways, Shikamaru tells Eida not to worry, as well as not to push herself too far, since the information she provides, no matter the stipulations tied to it, still is extremely useful for them. Eida then moves the conversation over and says that they need to have a talk about Boruto. She asks Shikamaru about why he had the sudden change in heart, about not trying to kill Boruto anymore, as well as why Shikamaru used Mitsuki to let Boruto escape the Leaf Village. Shikamaru denies the allegation, saying he doesn't know what what she is talking about, but he realizes that this is futile due to the omniscient nature of Eida's abilities, where she can see and know everything. Eida then explains that she isn't going to snitch on Shikamaru, as it means that Shikamaru would likely lose his position as Hokage, which would inadvertently end up being bad for her as well, and she says as well as this, she also doesn't want to cause any trouble for Boruto, which if you've been watching the channel for a little while now, is proving what I've been banging on about for a while now, where Eida is slowly falling for Boruto. The seeds have been planted for a long ass time by this point, and I'm going to do an entire video dedicated to how Eida is falling for Boruto, so if you shippers out there want to see that video, or add your thoughts, then make sure to let me know in the comments down below, because I'm slightly stepping outside of my comfort zone by doing a shipping video, since I haven't really been in the shipping scene at all, especially in Boruto. So consider that video in the future, me dipping my toes into that style of video. But just quickly to go over the implications of this moment, you can see Eida notices Shikamaru gives her the fattest side eye, and she quickly realizes that she was meant to say this inside of her head, but this isn't the first time she has let slip her secret feelings for Boruto, as each time it seems to come in a similar fashion. So I'm excited to see Kishimoto continue to push his narrative, and I also think it's interesting that all of the people who are supposedly in love with Boruto are all part of this friendship trio, as if they are all competing for Boruto's love. And I saw someone in the comment section say something really funny, saying why doesn't Boruto just have all of them at once? Which I think is just absolutely hilarious. And to be honest, it would be fitting for the GOAT of all shinobi. But I think the most interesting thing about Eida seemingly falling for Boruto is how she feels about Kawaki, as there have been a few interactions between Eida and Kawaki that makes it clear that Eida still is in love with Kawaki. So I guess it's a waiting game to see how all of that unfolds. Anyways, Eida tells Shikamaru that Kawaki has also agreed to cooperate with Boruto, just for the time being to help deal with the Shinju. She warns Shikamaru that he shouldn't interfere with them two for his own sake, especially if he wants to ultimately deal with the Shinju, since this collaboration is the most beneficial outcome there is. Shikamaru then takes the reins of the conversation and says to Eida that he's aware that Boruto has a secret collaborator. He then asks Eida if she has been able to see him, but Eida just ignores this and Shikamaru keeps pressing, and he says the last time this secret collaborator took the form of a frog, something which Shikamaru recognizes from somewhere previously. And he puts the dots together and asks Eida whether this secret ally of Boruto's is actually Kashin Koji. Eida just kind of glances at him, and the next thing you know, a flipping frog pops out of Eida's hair, and this toad goes on to confirm that Shikamaru's assumption was correct. And Kashin Koji offers Shikamaru information under the conditions that Shikamaru does not ask any further questions beyond what he's about to be told. Going back to the idea we saw at the start of the chapter of the point of singularity, where the more information people are told about their future, the more you derail the current future's fate, and the harder it becomes to use 10 directions. So by offering guidance through uncertain information that Shikamaru doesn't know is information gathered from the future, it means that Kashin Koji is making sure that people don't start acting differently, causing more possible futures to come about. Anyways, getting back to the chapter, Shikamaru is taken aback from seeing a toad pop out of Eida's hair, and obviously is skeptical about what the toad is about to say. Kashin Koji tells Shikamaru that he must only deploy Konohamaru, Sarada, and Mitsuki to the Land of Wind. He then says Ryu or Matsuri, or potentially even both of them, will end up showing up looking for Gaara. He then says that their trio must work together with the two shinobi from the sand in order to defeat the Shinju. Shikamaru doesn't trust his information, says why on earth will you let some toad control the fate of this mission, and inevitably the fate of the village, but the toad just continues telling Shikamaru to not ask any further questions. Kashin Koji says that if anyone were to refuse to go along with his plan, then Shikamaru must come up with his own reasoning as to why they must go. Now a lot of people may assume that if Shikamaru was to go along with his plan, then this mission would be a guaranteed success. However, that would be a misunderstanding of how 10 Directions works, as 10 Directions actually works by looking at all the possible futures, but not just one future, but all of the possible outcomes. This is why Kashin Koji was unsure as to whether both Shinju would arrive to retrieve Gaara, and it's because there is different variations of the future he can foresee. This also means that the mission itself in some futures will be a success, but it does mean in other scenarios that they would end up failing. However, Kashin Koji can see that where the success rate is highest is when these three shinobi from Konoha and the two sand shinobi end up working together. I think that this idea is a really good way of making it so Kashin Koji's power doesn't ruin the anticipation for future events, due to how different things may transpire with different likelihoods, it means that Kashin Koji's role is altered to provide their side with the highest probability of success rather than a guaranteed one. Anyways, Kashin Koji also reveals that under no circumstances should Himawari be allowed to leave the village, since if that were to happen, Jura would instantly find her and kill her without hesitation. And this future is actually guaranteed. Again, showing how it's a game of probabilities with 10 directions, meaning Kashin Koji is constantly working to figure out what ensures their highest probability of success. He then explains that by keeping Himawari in Konoha, they can prevent Jura from showing up to take her, since Jura views Konoha's culture and information as highly valuable. And if Jura was to end up showing up and trying to take Himawari, it would end in a huge battle, ultimately destroying Konoha. He then says that despite Jura not coming for Himawari, if he were to show up to Konoha, they must treat him as their #1 customer no matter what. And this scenario would only happen if Jura was to go to a bookshop. But I think this would be hilarious to see Jura pull up. Despite him being the root of evil and killing so many of their citizens, they gotta treat this guy with respect. And I'm actually begging Kishimoto does this because it will just be too funny. Anyways, he continues to say that if Jura was to attack, then their chance of winning wouldn't even come to 1 in a million. Despite them having all the tactics, the battle IQ, the strength of Kawaki, Boruto, Damon, Eida, Sarada, Mitsuki, every strong shinobi you could think of, they wouldn't even come anywhere remotely near to Jura. This scaling is getting out of hand, and it makes you wonder how on earth is anybody going to be able to catch up to this guy. The way this guy's getting painted makes him seem comparable to even Shibai at this point. And it seems that almost every single chapter, the narrative power of Jura just seems to grow and grow and grow. So the power jump from any single character is going to have to be monumental in order to deal with Jura. However, monthly jougan cope incoming, it would make sense for a power like that to be the answer to this cataclysm, and obviously as well, the power of the Karma V3. So, you know, these powers must be coming soon, am I right? And I'm going to be doing a video dedicated to these two powers coming soon, so subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss when that video gets released. But moving on, Kashin Koji says that their best way or chances of defeating Jura is to slowly chip away at his forces one by one. However, if Jura was to ever show up, don't even bother trying to fight him, and they must retreat immediately. However, that's all the information we are going to get out of Kashin Koji, and before he leaves, he thanks Shikamaru for going against the rules and trusting his heart. He says that Shikamaru's decision to free Boruto may just change the fate of their world, so he is extremely grateful for that. He then says that he isn't forcing Shikamaru under any means to listen to what he's saying. However, what Kashin Koji is saying is for the sake of their future, and Shikamaru must continue to follow his heart, as that is what has led him to make the correct judgments thus far. Anyways, getting back to the chapter, we see Eida glancing into the distance, quoting, "Follow your heart." Now, I could be reading this moment incorrectly as the panel shifts to Sumire. However, the way I'm taking this is it's actually Eida's mind which is telling her to continue to pursue Kawaki. And the reason I say this is her mind is telling her this rather than her heart. And this is because regardless of how Kawaki treats her, she is almost under this genjutsu where she can ignore all of this and still want to be with Kawaki. However, she can clearly see that Boruto is the better person and also meets the requirements she looks for where they are unaffected by her charm. So by following her heart, it would lead her to fall for Boruto instead. And it's clear with all the internal monologues we have seen with Eida, where she constantly has moments where she can't contain her emotions towards Boruto, with the outbursts where she says stuff like Boruto that was so hot, or when she blushes at Boruto. It's clear that Eida is suppressing her heart with her mind, and her true emotions is to pursue Boruto, and her mind is telling her what she thinks she wants, which is Kawaki, since that has been her goal for so many years. Her mind is almost hyper-focused on Kawaki, and she can't see the truth about the situation. And Eida is becoming aware of this, and that is why the idea of follow your heart has had such a big impact on her mentally. And he's back in the chapter, we jump straight to the Sand Village, where we can see Sarada, Mitsuki, and Konohamaru standing on top of a cliff, all looking down into the land of wind. So it's clear that Kishimoto wanted to show that Shikamaru followed Kashin Koji's advice without actually showing him going through the process of assembling this squad, which I think is a great narrative technique that creates a much more impactful moment where we suddenly jump to this scene and it's almost unsaid, but we also know in our minds that Shikamaru has decided to follow his heart here. And since it came straight after Eida thinking to herself, follow your heart, it's just such an amazing scene in my opinion that ties together the message that Kashin Koji said of follow your heart, and it just does that all perfectly. Anyways, Mitsuki notices that something is wrong with Sarada and asks her what is up, but she just replies saying it's nothing and not to worry about it. However, it's obvious that what Sumire has said to her is taking its toll on her mentally. Sarada isn't a mean person, she is loving and cares for her friends, and she clearly doesn't want to hurt Sumire, and that's why she is losing so much concentration here, and she didn't even realize that what she was doing was hurting people, but because she has become aware of this now, it's taken a massive toll on her mentally, which is a very human reaction from her. So it will be interesting to see whether this lapse of concentration will come back to haunt her as they pursue the Shinju, or whether she'll be able to put this aside for the time being to deal with the mission at hand. Anyways, we have seen that the two Sand Village ninja have found the Konoha trio, and it looks to be Yodo and Arya, and it's clear that Yodo is clearly coming back for vengeance after seeing her close friend being consumed by a tree. And we find out that the Konoha Strike Squad is being called Core. Not sure if that's useful information, but it's there nonetheless. Mitsuki then asks Konohamaru about the information Shikamaru has acquired, and Konohamaru agrees that he thinks that it's plausible, but he's still half doubtful about how Shikamaru could predict such events would occur. Yodo then talks to Sarada and says that her vibe has changed, and she wonders if Sarada has taken a liking to a guy. Sarada is shocked or almost overwhelmed as you can see that visually there is sweat dripping off her face, and she stumbles over her words, saying that this is not the case, clearly showing that the mission at hand is clearly not the only thing on Sarada's mind, which again takes me back to that idea that I mentioned earlier, as to whether what Sumire has said will constantly be playing on her mind and end up taking its toll on her capabilities during this mission, as almost every other person on the mission has noticed that there is something up with her right now. Regardless, Konohamaru notices the Shinju, who are just standing over a frog, and he realizes that this is the worst case scenario, where both the Shinju have ended up showing up to find Shinki. Ryu and Matsuri say that this frog is a clue that will end up connecting them to Boruto, and that is where the chapter ends. So this is seemingly the beginning of the Retrieve Shinki arc officially, which to be honest has taken much longer than I expected to start, but I cannot complain since the revelations we have received in the meantime seem to have been very worthwhile. But you can make sure to expect plenty of action in the coming chapters, and I must say Sarada's Mangekyo Sharingan seems almost imminent at this point in the story, so 100% expect that in the coming chapters, as I know many of you have been waiting so eagerly for that to come. Anyways, with that all said, that is going to be a wrap for this video, so if you did enjoy, please consider smashing the like button, just so I know you guys are enjoying the content, and it also pushes this video out to more and more people. Also, be sure to comment your thoughts on this chapter in the comments down below, and also if you want to see more content like this, then be sure to subscribe so YouTube recommends my videos to you in the future. And I'm aware that I legit haven't uploaded since the last chapter, but expect many more videos coming into December. I don't want to leak too much yet, but I have some banger concepts in the working, so stay tuned for them. But with that all said, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.